The camera always stops rolling eventually. That was the thought racing through Senator John Kennedy's mind as he watched Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stride into the Senate Appropriations Committee hearing room that cold March morning, her entourage trailing behind her like pilot fish following a shark. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never truly lost, never been cornered, never faced an opponent who had spent 6 months preparing for this exact moment. The hearing was supposed to be about federal housing policy, a dry technical discussion of HUD budget allocations that would normally attract maybe 3 journalists and a handful of policy wonks. Instead, the gallery was packed wall to wall with progressive activists, their phones held high, ready to capture their champion's latest viral moment. They had come to witness AOC dismantle another old white man from the South, to watch her reduce another dinosaur to stammering defensiveness, while social media exploded with celebration. What none of them knew, what AOC herself couldn't have guessed, was that the gentleman from Louisiana had been waiting for her, not just for this hearing, but for months. Behind his desk sat 6 manila folders, each one thicker than the last, each containing documentation that would transform hunter into hunted, accuser into accused, revolutionary into cautionary tale. In 4 hours, one of them would walk out of this room vindicated. The other would leave in ruins, their carefully constructed image shattered beyond repair, their political future reduced to ashes and regret. The young congresswoman reached the witness table and adjusted her microphone with practiced ease, her burgundy blazer catching the harsh overhead lights. She smiled at the cameras, that now famous smile that launched 1,000 memes and fundraising emails. Behind her, staff members distributed prepared statements to the press, already confident of the narrative they would write tonight. Senator Kennedy sat motionless at the dais, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the fluorescent glow, his weathered hands folded with the patience of a hunter who had learned long ago that stillness kills more reliably than motion. He had seen this performance before, the righteous indignation, the performative empathy, the assumption that a southern drawl and gray hair meant an easy target. Let her think that. Let her believe her own press releases. The trap was already set. All he needed was for her to step into it. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, intoxicated by her own mythology, was about to take that step. Senator Kennedy, I want to start by thanking you for finally holding hearings on housing policy, though I know it's taken 3 years of grassroots pressure to get us here. AOC's voice carried that peculiar mixture of youth and authority that had made her famous, addressing the 73-year-old senator as if he were a recalcitrant student finally showing up for detention. The activists in the gallery murmured their approval, phones already recording, thumbs poised over Twitter to disseminate whatever soundbite she produced next. Kennedy didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, the way a poker player watches an opponent who doesn't realize they're already holding a losing hand. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before he leaned toward his microphone. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, his Louisiana drawl wrapping around each syllable like honey dripping from a spoon, I appreciate your attendance at our humble proceedings. Your passion for housing policy is well documented, particularly on social media. I'm looking forward to a substantive discussion about solutions. The response seemed gentle, almost deferential. AOC's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something beneath the surface but unable to identify the threat. She pressed forward, reading from her prepared statement about the housing crisis, the failure of federal programs, the need for radical intervention. Her presentation was polished, rehearsed, designed for maximum viral impact. She spoke of families sleeping in cars, of children in overcrowded apartments, of the American dream deferred by corporate greed and government indifference. It was powerful theater. She was very good at theater. When she finished, she looked directly at Kennedy with an expression of moral superiority so pronounced it was almost theatrical. "Senator," she said, her voice taking on an edge, Millions of Americans are suffering while Congress debates and delays. We don't need more studies or more hearings. We need action. We need leaders willing to fight the powerful interests that have turned housing into a commodity instead of a human right. The gallery erupted in applause. This was what they had come for, their champion speaking truth to power, demanding justice from the old guard. Kennedy waited for the noise to subside, then reached beneath his desk and produced the first manila folder. He opened it with the care of a surgeon making an initial incision, revealing a stack of documents at least 3 inches thick. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice still conversational but carrying a new undertone that made several committee members lean forward. "You mentioned fighting powerful interests that treat housing as a commodity. I think that's an important topic. Would you be comfortable if we examined your own relationship with housing and real estate?" The change in AOC's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders tensed. Her smile became fixed. Behind her, a staff member shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that something had just shifted in the room's dynamics. "My relationship with housing." AOC recovered quickly, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "Senator, I don't see how my personal situation is relevant to federal policy." "Oh, but it's very relevant," Kennedy replied, his fingers resting gently on the folder. "You see, Congresswoman, you've built your entire political brand on authenticity, on being different from typical politicians, on representing working people against elite exploitation. If we're going to discuss housing policy, we should start with understanding whether the person lecturing us about it practices what they preach." He lifted the first document from the folder, holding it up for the cameras. "This is a property record from Queens County. It shows that you and your partner, Mr. Riley Roberts, currently reside in a luxury apartment in Navy Yard, a development that was built using the very tax abatements and developer incentives you publicly condemn. The monthly rent on your unit is $3,400. That's more than the median household income in parts of your district." AOC's face flushed. "That's a completely unfair characterization." "Is it?" Kennedy's eyebrows rose above his glasses. "Let me read from the developer's own marketing materials." He pulled out a glossy brochure. "Navy Yard, where luxury meets innovation. Apartments featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, chef-inspired kitchens, and exclusive amenities including a private gym, rooftop terrace, and 24-hour concierge service." He set the brochure down carefully. "While your constituents live in rent-stabilized apartments with broken elevators and mice, you enjoy a doorman." The comparison hung in the air like an accusation. In the gallery, several activists had stopped recording, their expressions shifting from triumphant to confused. "But here's what really interests me," Kennedy continued, pulling out another document. "This luxury building was constructed using $480 million in city and state tax incentives, including a 25-year property tax abatement. You, Congresswoman, live in a building that exists precisely because of the kind of corporate welfare you claim to oppose. Your rent is subsidized by the very system you rail against." "I don't control where I live," AOC protested, her composure beginning to crack. "The housing market in New York is impossible." "Exactly my point," Kennedy agreed, his tone remaining pleasant. "The housing market is impossible, which is why we need thoughtful policy, not performative outrage. But let's dig deeper into your housing choices because I think they reveal something important about the gap between your rhetoric and reality." He produced another document, this one appearing to be a financial disclosure form. "According to your congressional financial disclosures, you reported $0 in assets when you took office. Zero. No savings, no investments, nothing. Yet somehow you managed to afford an apartment in one of New York's most expensive new developments. How does that work?" The question hung in the air, unanswered because there was no good answer. Kennedy didn't wait for one. "Let me help explain," he said, pulling out what appeared to be bank records. "These are financial records obtained through proper legal channels showing that your partner, Mr. Roberts, has been making the rent payments on your apartment. All of them. You've been living rent-free in a luxury building while presenting yourself as someone struggling with housing costs, just like your constituents. The revelation rippled through the gallery. Phone screens glowed brighter as activists frantically searched for confirmation, their faith beginning to waver. But it gets more interesting. Kennedy continued, warming to his theme. Mr. Roberts, according to his financial disclosures and tax records, works as a consultant for technology companies. His income last year was approximately $230,000. So you, Congresswoman, who campaigns on representing working people, are being financially supported by someone making more than 4 times the median American household income while living in subsidized luxury housing. AOC's attorney leaned forward to whisper urgently in her ear, but she shook her head, her jaw set in stubborn defiance. "This is a personal attack," she said, her voice rising. "You're trying to distract from the housing crisis by attacking my living situation." "No," Kennedy corrected gently, "I'm trying to illustrate that you lack the moral authority to lecture anyone about housing when you yourself benefit from exactly the kind of arrangements you publicly condemn. There's a word for that, Congresswoman: hypocrisy." He closed the first folder with deliberate finality and reached for the second, this one even thicker than the first. "But let's move beyond where you live and talk about what you own, because that story is even more revealing." As Kennedy opened the second folder, AOC's chief of staff could be seen urgently typing on their phone, likely trying to prepare damage control for what was clearly becoming a disaster. The confident young woman who had entered the hearing room 40 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone beginning to understand that they had walked into an ambush. "Senator, I think we should return to discussing actual housing policy rather than my personal," AOC began, but Kennedy interrupted with the gentlest of gestures, simply holding up one finger as he adjusted his glasses and began reading from a new document. "Congresswoman, I want to discuss policy. Truly I do. But policy flows from understanding, and understanding requires examining whether policymakers practice what they preach. So let's examine your recent real estate transaction, because I think your constituents would find it illuminating." He held up what appeared to be a property deed. "On December 15th of last year, you and Mr. Roberts purchased a condominium in Southeast Washington, D.C. The purchase price was $420,000 for a studio apartment." He let that sink in before continuing. "Now, according to your financial disclosures, you had no assets and no savings. So where did a first-term congresswoman with student loan debt get the money for a $400,000 down payment?" AOC remained silent, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, the confident social media star replaced by someone who suddenly understood the depth of the trap they had sprung. "The interest-only mortgage," Kennedy continued, reading from what appeared to be loan documents, "was provided by Congressional Federal Credit Union at an interest rate of 2.1%, substantially below market rate. The loan required only 5% down, $21,000, but here's what's fascinating." He pulled out another document. "Your campaign had just reported having $300,000 in unpaid debts to various vendors, money you owed to working people who had provided services. Yet somehow you found $21,000 for a luxury condo down payment." Several gasps echoed through the gallery. The narrative was shifting in real time, the revolutionary hero being exposed as just another politician who talked one way and lived another. "But wait, there's more," Kennedy said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone now, as if he regretted having to continue but felt duty-bound to do so. "The condo you purchased is in a building that was constructed using historic preservation tax credits and new market tax credits, federal programs that allow wealthy developers to reduce their tax burden while building upscale housing. You bought into exactly the kind of development your housing platform opposes." He produced a printed tweet. "This is from your official account, dated 3 months before you bought that condo. You wrote, and I quote, 'Tax credits for luxury housing are theft from working families. They enrich developers while displacing communities. We need to eliminate these corporate giveaways. Then you turned around and bought a luxury condo that exists because of those very tax credits. The contradiction was so stark, so undeniable that even AOC supporters in the gallery seemed stunned into silence. Their phones had lowered, no longer recording a triumph but rather a demolition. Now let's talk about what happened after you purchased that condo, Kennedy continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. Within 2 weeks, you listed your apartment for rent on short-term rental platforms. You became a landlord congresswoman. The woman who tweets about abolishing landlords and seizing rental property became one herself. He pulled out a printed screenshot showing a luxury apartment listing. This is your DC condo listed on a corporate housing site for $7,800 per month. That's almost double your mortgage payment. You're extracting profit from housing, engaging in exactly the kind of behavior you condemn when others do it. I needed to offset my housing costs, AOC stammered. Of course you did, Kennedy agreed. Everyone needs to offset their costs. That's called economics. But when working people do it, you call them exploiters. When you do it, it's justified necessity. Do you see the problem? The problem, Kennedy continued, pulling out yet another document, is that you then claim the interest on your mortgage as a tax deduction, using the very tax code loopholes you campaign on closing. Your accountant, according to these filings, also helped you establish an LLC to hold the property, shielding you from liability and creating the exact kind of corporate structure you claim enables exploitation. He looked up at her over his glasses. You didn't just become a landlord congresswoman. You became a corporate landlord, with an LLC, taking tax deductions, charging above market rent. You became everything you claim to oppose, and you did it while lecturing the rest of us about housing justice. AOC's hands were trembling now, gripping the edge of the witness table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her political identity, so carefully constructed around authenticity and moral clarity, was crumbling in real time under the weight of documented contradictions. But here's what truly troubles me, Kennedy said, his voice softening into something resembling genuine sadness. This letter. He held up a handwritten note on lined paper. This is from James Martinez, a retired postal worker in your district. Would you like me to read it? AOC didn't respond, but Kennedy began reading anyway, his voice heavy with emotion. Dear Senator Kennedy, I am writing because I don't know where else to turn. My building was bought by new owners who are pushing out longtime tenants like me. I wrote to Representative Ocasio-Cortez 6 times asking for help, even went to her district office 3 times. No one would see me. Then I saw online that she bought an expensive condo in DC and is renting it out for profit. She doesn't answer letters from working people, but she has time to become a landlord. I thought she was different. I was wrong. The letter's authenticity was devastating, the pain of betrayal evident in every line. Kennedy carefully folded it and set it aside. James Martinez worked for the United States Postal Service for 37 years. He lives on a fixed income of $1,800 per month. Your condo rent alone is more than 4 times his total monthly income, and you couldn't find time to help him. AOC's tears began flowing then, dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks, the perfect social media image literally dissolving before the cameras. But we're not done yet, Kennedy said quietly, reaching for his third folder. Because your housing hypocrisy, as damaging as it is, pales in comparison to what we need to discuss next. Your relationship with money, power, and the very corporate interests you claim to fight. As Kennedy opened the third folder, the hearing room felt like a tomb, silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the quiet whir of cameras capturing every moment of AOC's destruction. The activists who had come to celebrate their hero's triumph were instead witnessing her exposure, and there was still more to come. The worst, everyone suddenly understood, was yet to be revealed. Senator Kennedy adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled the third folder closer, its thickness suggesting hours more of damaging revelations. The hearing room had gone from celebration to shocked silence, the atmosphere so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. AOC sat at the witness table, Her earlier confidence completely shattered, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone beginning to understand the full scope of their exposure. "Congresswoman," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl somehow making each word cut deeper, "you've built your brand on being incorruptible, on refusing corporate PAC money, on representing a new kind of politics untainted by special interests. Let's examine how well that brand holds up under scrutiny." He produced a thick stack of Federal Election Commission reports, each page marked with colored tabs. "These are your campaign finance disclosures going back to your first race. I've spent considerable time studying them with the help of forensic accountants, and I must say, the patterns they reveal are quite troubling." AOC's attorney attempted to interject, "Senator, I don't see how historical campaign finance reports are relevant to a hearing on housing policy," but Kennedy simply smiled. "Everything is connected, counsel. How someone handles money, how they build their career, how they present themselves versus how they actually operate. It all tells us whether they have the judgment and integrity to shape policy affecting millions of lives." He opened to a tabbed section. "Let's start with something simple. Your 2018 campaign proudly proclaimed it would not accept corporate PAC money. Very admirable stance, very much on brand. However, these FEC reports show that entities controlled by your then Chief of Staff, Saikat Chakrabarty, received over $1 million from Justice Democrats PAC and Brand New Congress PAC, both of which he founded and controlled. That money then flowed to LLCs he also controlled before eventually finding its way to your campaign. The setup was so circuitous, so deliberately opaque, that even Kennedy's Democrat colleagues were leaning forward with interest. So technically," Kennedy continued, "you didn't take corporate PAC money. You just took money that had been laundered through multiple entities to disguise its origin. That's not refusing corporate money, Congresswoman. That's money laundering with extra steps." The term, money laundering, hit the room like a thunderclap. Several reporters immediately began typing furiously on their phones. The accusation was serious enough that AOC's attorney was now whispering urgently in her ear, probably advising her to end the hearing immediately. "Those were legitimate campaign expenditures," AOC managed, her voice weak. "Legitimate," Kennedy repeated thoughtfully. "Let's explore that word." He pulled out highlighted documents. "Your campaign paid $6,000 to your romantic partner, Mr. Riley Roberts, for marketing consulting. What specific marketing deliverables did Mr. Roberts provide?" Silence. He pulled out another document. "Your campaign paid Brand New Campaign LLC, controlled by Mr. Chakrabarty, $885,000 for strategic consulting. What strategy exactly? What consulting?" "The LLC doesn't have to disclose that information, which is precisely why you used an LLC instead of direct payment." More silence. The trap wasn't just closing, it was crushing. "Then there's this interesting payment," Kennedy continued, seemingly enjoying himself now despite his earlier claims of taking no pleasure in the destruction. $12,000 to Bombazo Dance Company listed as team building and training. Your campaign paid for salsa lessons with donor money. Is learning to salsa essential to housing policy? A few nervous laughs rippled through the gallery, but they died quickly. This wasn't funny anymore. It was a systematic dismantling of everything AOC claimed to represent. Kennedy wasn't finished. "Here's a payment of $2,800 to a restaurant in Queens listed only as strategy session. That's one expensive dinner. Here's $1,500 for transportation with no itemization of where, when, or why. Here's $3,400 to someone named Juan Gonzalez for training with no detail about what training." He looked up from the documents. "Federal law requires itemization of expenditures over $200. You have hundreds of payments that violate that requirement, totaling over $300,000 in unaccounted spending. That's not campaign finance. That's a personal slush fund. But the real issue," Kennedy continued, his voice hardening, "is the pattern. You demand transparency from everyone else. You call for disclosure, for accountability, for wealthy individuals and corporations to show exactly where their money goes. But when it comes to your own finances, you use every loophole, every technicality, every sketchy arrangement available. He pulled out one final document from this folder. This is a letter from the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan watchdog group. They write, Representative Ocasio-Cortez's campaign finance practices represent exactly the kind of opacity and potential abuse that erode public trust in democratic institutions. While her rhetoric emphasizes transparency, her actions demonstrate sophisticated evasion of disclosure requirements. Kennedy set the letter down. They're calling you sophisticated at evasion. That's not a compliment, Congresswoman. That's an indictment. AOC's tears had returned, but now they seemed less like emotional breakdown and more like the tears of someone who had finally been caught after years of successfully gaming the system. Senator, these are taken out of context, she tried weakly. Context, Kennedy repeated. Let me give you context. He stood up, something he rarely did during hearings, and his movement commanded the room's complete attention. While you were using campaign money for dance lessons and unitemized strategy sessions, while you were funneling money through shell companies, while you were paying your boyfriend campaign funds for nebulous consulting work, the people who believed in you were donating $5, $10, $20 they couldn't afford because they thought you were different. He gestured to the folders spread before him. Every document here represents a betrayal of that trust. Every sketchy payment, every laundered dollar, every opaque transaction is you taking advantage of working people who believed your promises of a new kind of politics. You didn't bring new politics, Congresswoman. You just brought old corruption with a better Instagram account. The condemnation was complete, total, devastating. Even hardened political reporters looked shaken by the thoroughness of the exposure. But Kennedy wasn't done. He had 3 more folders, and everyone in the room could see them sitting there, waiting, promising further revelations that would leave nothing of AOC's reputation intact. As he reached for the 4th folder, the committee chairman called for a brief recess, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps simply to let reporters file their stories and the impact of what had already been revealed to fully sink in. As AOC stood on shaking legs and fled the hearing room pursued by shouting questions, Kennedy remained seated, surrounded by his evidence, looking less like a triumphant victor and more like a teacher who had just been forced to fail a student he wished had studied harder. The tragedy, everyone suddenly understood, wasn't just that AOC had been exposed. It was that she had brought it entirely upon herself. When the hearing reconvened 30 minutes later, the gallery had undergone a dramatic transformation. Many of AOC's young progressive supporters had quietly departed during the recess, unwilling to witness further destruction of their political hero. The media section, however, had swollen to overflowing, with reporters standing along the back wall, sensing they were witnessing a generational political moment. AOC returned to the witness table looking haggard, her makeup hastily repaired, but unable to hide the redness around her eyes or the defeated slump of her shoulders. The blazer that had seemed so sharp and professional when she arrived now looked wrinkled and somehow smaller, as if the revelations had physically diminished her. Senator Kennedy settled back into his chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had all the time in the world. The 4th folder sat before him, unopened but radiating promise of further devastation. He took a sip of water, adjusted his glasses one more time, and began. Congresswoman, let's discuss your signature political achievement, the Green New Deal. You've called climate change the defining challenge of our generation, an existential threat requiring immediate, dramatic action. Your resolution calls for completely decarbonizing the American economy within 10 years. Is that correct? AOC's voice was barely audible. Yes. I need you to speak up for the record, please. Yes, AOC repeated, slightly louder. Climate change is an existential threat. I don't disagree, Kennedy said mildly. It's a serious issue requiring thoughtful policy, which is why I was so interested to review your personal carbon footprint and lifestyle choices. Would you like to know what I found? He didn't wait for an answer. This, he held up a bound report, is a compilation of your travel records from January 2020 through December 2023, assembled from publicly available flight data, social media posts, campaign finance records, and Freedom of Information Act requests. In those 4 years, you took 163 flights. The number hung in the air like an indictment. But quantity isn't the real issue, Kennedy continued. It's the type of travel. 53 of those flights were on private jets. Private jets, Congresswoman, the single most carbon-intensive form of transportation available. A stunned silence gripped the room. Even reporters who thought they were beyond shocking looked genuinely surprised. Kennedy pulled out a detailed spreadsheet. Let's examine some specific examples. March 2022, you attended a climate rally in Austin, Texas. Commercial airlines offer multiple daily flights from D.C. to Austin, but you chose to fly private. Your round-trip carbon footprint for that single journey exceeded the annual emissions of an average American. He looked up at her. You gave a speech about the need for personal sacrifice to combat climate change, then flew private back to Washington. AOC tried to mount a defense. Security concerns sometimes require security, Kennedy interrupted gently. This flight manifest shows you traveled with 2 staff members, not security personnel. The plane, a Gulfstream G550, seats up to 18 passengers. You used a plane designed for 18 people to transport 3, burning through thousands of gallons of jet fuel to avoid the inconvenience of commercial aviation. He pulled out another record. Here's another interesting trip. April 2023, Earth Day weekend. You flew private to Miami for a climate fundraiser dinner, then the next day private to Los Angeles for a podcast appearance about climate action, then private back to D.C. 3 private flights in 3 days while telling Americans they need to drive less and fly less. He did some quick calculation on his phone. That weekend alone, your personal carbon emissions exceeded the annual footprint of 12 average American families. But perhaps my favorite, Kennedy said, holding up a photograph, is this one. May 2023, you attended the Met Gala, that bastion of populist politics. He showed the photo to the cameras, AOC in an elaborate gown with "Tax the Rich" emblazoned across the back. You flew private jet to New York for this event, where you wore a dress worth approximately $17,000 to an event with a $35,000 ticket price, all while displaying your concern for working people and climate change. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking. He set the photo down carefully. The carbon footprint from that one private jet trip and the production of that dress exceeded what a minimum wage worker in your district will generate in 5 years. But you got great photos for Instagram, so I suppose it was worth it. AOC's face had gone from pale to gray. Her hands, visible above the table, were trembling. This was worse than the housing revelations, worse than the campaign finance exposure, because this struck at the very heart of her political identity, her role as climate champion. Let's look at your ground transportation, Kennedy continued, clearly in no mood to show mercy. Your campaign and congressional office spent $47,000 on Uber, Lyft, and car services in 2022. $47,000. New York and D.C. both have extensive public transportation systems, yet you took approximately 230 car service rides. He pulled out a specific receipt. This one particularly caught my attention. Uber from your apartment to a coffee shop 4 blocks away. Distance, 0.3 miles. A 5-minute walk. But walking doesn't fit your lifestyle, apparently. He pulled out his tablet and connected it to the hearing room display. Using EPA carbon footprint calculators and the travel data we've compiled, your personal carbon emissions for 2022 were 283 metric tons of CO2. The average American produces 16 tons. You personally generated more carbon than 17 average Americans while building a career telling them to make sacrifices. The number glowed on the screen, impossible to dispute, devastating in its mathematical simplicity. 283 tons. But surely, Kennedy continued with mock hopefulness, you offset these emissions somehow. Do you purchase carbon credits? Silence. Do you invest in renewable energy projects to compensate for your massive carbon footprint? More silence. Have you taken any concrete personal action to offset the environmental damage your lifestyle causes? The silence stretched, broken only by the clicking of camera shutters capturing AOC's complete inability to respond. You know what's fascinating, Kennedy said, his voice taking on a professorial tone. Your Green New Deal calls for net zero emissions by 2030. That's 6 years away. You propose eliminating fossil fuels, retrofitting every building in America, and transitioning to 100% renewable energy in less time than it takes to plan and build a single power plant. He pulled out an economic analysis. Multiple independent economists have estimated the cost at between $50 and $93 trillion over 10 years. That's 3 to 7 times our current GDP. Did you do a cost-benefit analysis before proposing legislation that would fundamentally restructure the entire American economy? Did you consult with engineers about technical feasibility? Did you model the economic impact on working families? AOC's silence answered more eloquently than words ever could. You proposed to spend trillions of dollars on a plan you couldn't explain, didn't cost out, and personally refused to live by, Kennedy summarized. While demanding Americans sacrifice their cars, their jobs, their way of life, you fly private jets and take Uber's 4 blocks. He leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly very tired. You want to know the real tragedy, Congresswoman? Climate change is a serious issue. We do need policy solutions. But every time you fly private to a climate conference, every time you take a car service instead of public transit, every time you demand sacrifices from others while exempting yourself, you hand ammunition to those who deny climate change exists. You're not helping the environment. You're hurting the cause by making climate advocacy look like elitist hypocrisy. He pulled out one final document. This is an email from a climate scientist at MIT declining your invitation to co-sponsor climate legislation. Would you like me to read it? AOC looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, but Kennedy read anyway. Dr. Patricia Chen writes, "While I appreciate Representative Ocasio-Cortez's passion for climate action, I cannot attach my name and credibility to proposals that lack scientific rigor, or to politicians whose personal choices so starkly contradict their public positions. Effective climate policy requires both good science and good faith. I see little evidence of either in this case." The rejection from an actual climate scientist was somehow more damaging than anything Kennedy himself could say. These were her own allies, her own community, calling her out for hypocrisy. "You've made climate change a partisan joke," Kennedy said quietly. "You've given people permission to dismiss the entire issue because its loudest advocate lives like carbon emissions don't matter. That's not leadership, Congresswoman. That's sabotage." He closed the climate folder and reached for the fifth, and what everyone hoped was the final folder. "But we have one more topic to cover. Your treatment of the very people you claim to represent. Your actual constituents, the working families in Queens and the Bronx who believed your promises. I think it's time they learned what kind of representation they've actually been getting." As Kennedy opened the final folder, AOC looked less like a politician facing tough questions and more like a defendant awaiting sentencing. And in many ways, that's exactly what this had become. A sentencing hearing for someone whose crimes were hypocrisy, exploitation, and the betrayal of trust. Senator Kennedy's final folder was noticeably more worn than the others, creased and thumbed through, suggesting he had returned to these materials repeatedly, perhaps struggling with whether to make this information public. When he opened it, his expression had shifted from prosecutorial to something approaching genuine sadness. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," he began softly, "you represent New York's 14th congressional district, portions of the Bronx and Queens. Some of the most diverse, hardworking communities in America. Immigrant families who came here with nothing, people working multiple jobs to survive, communities that believed you were one of them, that you understood their struggles. Let's discuss what your representation has actually meant for them. He pulled out crime statistics from the NYPD. In 2018, when you took office, your district reported 1,412 violent crimes. Last year, that number reached 2,137. That's a 51% increase in violent crime. Your constituents are demonstrably less safe than they were before you arrived in Congress. But AOC started, but Kennedy wasn't pausing. "Let me show you something," he said, connecting his tablet to the display once again. "These are testimonials I recorded last month in your district. I think the committee should hear directly from the people you represent." The screen filled with an elderly Asian woman, her face lined with worry. "My name is Kim Chen. I have lived in Elmhurst for 43 years. I wrote to Representative Ocasio-Cortez 8 times about crime in our neighborhood. Robberies, assaults, drug dealing on our corner. I never received a response. Not once. Last month my store was robbed for the 3rd time. Where is our congresswoman, taking pictures for magazines?" The video shifted to a middle-aged Latino man in a construction vest. "I'm Eduardo Ruiz. I lost my job when Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez drove Amazon away. I had 2 daughters in college. I had to take them out. They're working retail now instead of finishing their degrees. She celebrated destroying 25,000 jobs. My family paid the price for her Twitter victory." Another face appeared, a young black woman holding a toddler. "My name is Tasha Williams. I'm a single mother. I need childcare to work. I applied for assistance through every program. When I called the Congresswoman's office for help, they told me to email. I don't have a computer. They said email or nothing. I lost my job because I couldn't afford childcare, but I see she has time for Instagram photo shoots." Kennedy paused the video. "I have 43 of these testimonials, Congresswoman. Would you like to see more?" AOC was openly weeping now, but Kennedy continued, relentless in his methodical destruction. "Let's discuss your constituent services record. This is data from the House of Representatives showing response times and resolution rates for congressional offices. The average House member's office responds to constituent requests within 14 days. Your office averages 41 days, when they respond at all." He pulled out a stack of letters. "These are unanswered constituent letters retry L continue from your office, dating back 3 years. This one is from Marcus Thompson, a veteran trying to get help with his VA benefits. He wrote to you 6 times over 8 months. Never received a response. He finally got help from a Republican congressman from Long Island who doesn't even represent his district because that congressman, unlike you, actually cares about veterans more than viral moments." Kennedy held up another letter. "This is from the Ramirez family. Their son has special needs and they were being denied educational services. They wrote to you 4 times asking for help navigating the system. No response. They eventually had to hire a lawyer they couldn't afford because their congresswoman was too busy filming TikTok videos to help a disabled child." He set the letters down in a neat pile, each one representing a life damaged by neglect. "Your office has the lowest constituent service resolution rate in the New York delegation. The lowest. You're statistically the worst representative New York has in terms of actually helping the people who elected you. But let's talk about what you do have time for," Kennedy continued, pulling out a printed calendar. "This is your public schedule reconstructed from social media posts, news reports, and public appearances. In 2023, you attended 47 national media events, interviews, podcasts, and television appearances. You held 29 fundraisers outside your district. You traveled to 18 states for other candidates' campaigns." He looked up at her over his glasses. "Do you know how many town halls you held in your own district? 0. Not a single one. The last time you held an in-person town hall where your actual constituents could ask you questions directly was August 2019, 4.5 years ago. You've abandoned the very people who gave you this platform because you're too busy being famous to do the job they elected you to do." Kennedy produced another document. "This is a survey commissioned by the Queen's Chronicle of your constituents. 72% say you're more focused on national attention than district needs. 68% say they don't know how to reach your office. 57% say they regret voting for you. And most damning, when asked to name one concrete thing you've done to improve their lives, 64% couldn't name a single accomplishment. He let those numbers sink in before continuing. You haven't passed a single piece of legislation that became law. Not one. In 6 years in Congress, you haven't authored a single law that helps anyone. But you've certainly raised your profile. You've certainly become famous. You've certainly made yourself wealthy while your constituents struggle with crime, job loss, and being ignored by their own representative. Kennedy pulled out financial disclosures. When you took office, you claimed to have no assets and significant student debt. Today, according to these disclosures, your net worth is estimated between $1 and $5 million. In 6 years, you've become a millionaire while your district has become poorer and more dangerous. Explain to me how that represents the working class. Book deals, Kennedy read from the disclosures. $400,000 advance. Speaking fees, $25,000 to $50,000 per appearance. Netflix documentary deal, undisclosed amount but estimated at over $1 million. Podcast sponsorships. Social media partnerships. You've monetized your political position in ways that would make the most corrupt lobbyist blush. He pulled out a photograph, AOC at what appeared to be a glamorous event. This is you at the Vanity Fair Oscar party last year, rubbing shoulders with celebrities and billionaires. The ticket price to that event is $25,000. That's more than most of your constituents make in a year. But you were there, networking with Hollywood elites while your district dealt with a crime wave. Kennedy's voice grew heavier with something approaching genuine sorrow. You know what breaks my heart about all this? Your district is full of people who worked their entire lives for a chance their children didn't have to struggle like they did. They believed in you because you looked like them, talked like them, seemed to understand them, and you betrayed every single one of them for fame and fortune. He gestured to all the evidence spread before him, the luxury housing you condemn but live in, the campaign finance schemes you hide behind LLCs, the private jets you fly while preaching climate sacrifice, the constituents you ignore while chasing cameras, the wealth you've accumulated while they struggle. All of it adds up to one inescapable conclusion. You're a fraud. Not just a hypocrite, though you're certainly that. Not just ineffective, though you've accomplished nothing. You're a fraud who exploited working people's hope for your own enrichment and celebrity. You're exactly the kind of politician you claim to replace, just younger and better at social media. AOC's attorney was standing now, trying to end the hearing, but she waved him off with a gesture of defeat. There was nothing left to defend, no spin that could salvage this, no talking point that could overcome the mountain of documented evidence. Senator Kennedy closed the final folder and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes with the weariness of someone who had just done something necessary but deeply unpleasant. Congresswoman, when you walked in here this morning, you came to attack my character, my integrity, my right to represent working people. You thought I would be an easy target, an old Southern man with a funny accent. He put his glasses back on and looked directly at her. But I've spent 40 years in public service. I've made mistakes, plenty of them, but I've never pretended to be something I'm not. I've never exploited people's trust for personal gain. I've never claimed to represent the working class while flying private jets and living in luxury. I've never forgotten that this job is about serving others, not serving myself. You came here to expose me, he said quietly, but all you've done is expose yourself. And I didn't destroy you, Congresswoman. You destroyed yourself. I just held up the mirror. The hearing room sat in absolute silence. Even the reporters had stopped typing, recognizing they were witnessing something beyond political theater, a complete moral and professional annihilation. The committee chairman cleared his throat uncomfortably. I think this hearing is concluded unless there are any additional questions. No one spoke. What else was there to say? They had all witnessed the most thorough political destruction in modern congressional history. AOC stood on trembling legs, her attorney supporting her elbow as if she might collapse. She looked at Kennedy one last time, her face ravaged by tears and the weight of exposure, and whispered something that the microphones barely caught. "I'm sorry." Kennedy's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That's the first honest thing you've said all day, Congresswoman. Now go home to your district and try to earn it. Stop performing for cameras and start serving people. It's not too late to become the representative they thought they elected, but it will take work. Real work. Not tweets. Not photo ops. Work." As AOC fled the hearing room, pursued by a tsunami of shouting reporters and abandoned by her staff, Kennedy sat alone at the dais, surrounded by the evidence of her downfall. He had come to this hearing expecting to be attacked. He had left it having delivered one of the most devastating political takedowns in American history. But as he began slowly packing the folders into his briefcase, there was no triumph in his expression, only exhaustion and a deep sadness at the waste of potential, the corruption of promise, the betrayal of trust. A young aide approached tentatively. "Senator, that was incredible. You completely destroyed her." Kennedy looked up, his pale blue eyes tired behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Son, there's no joy in destroying someone, even when they deserve it. That young woman could have done real good if she'd been more interested in service than celebrity. What you witnessed wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy." He closed his briefcase and stood, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. "Come on, let's go home. I need to call my wife and remind myself why we do this job in the first place. Because it sure isn't for days like today." As Senator John Kennedy walked slowly from the hearing room, the lights dimmed on what would be remembered as the day political performance art met political reality, and reality won decisively. The revolution had been televised, just not the revolution anyone expected. And in the end, authenticity, preparation, and truth had proven stronger than any carefully curated social media brand could withstand. The cameras always stop rolling eventually, and when they did, all that remained was the truth. 3 weeks later, the political landscape had shifted in ways no one could have fully anticipated. Senator Kennedy had returned to Louisiana, declining most interview requests, letting the hearing speak for itself. The videos had gone viral, not among progressive activists celebrating their hero, but among millions of Americans who felt vindicated in their suspicion that much of modern politics was performance rather than substance. AOC had disappeared from social media for the first time in her political career. No tweets, no Instagram stories, no TikTok videos. The silence was deafening, and into that void rushed speculation, analysis, and an accounting that extended far beyond the hearing room. The House Ethics Committee announced formal investigations into her campaign finance practices, the shell company payments, and the undisclosed gifts. The Federal Election Commission opened its own inquiry. The New York State Attorney General's office began examining her real estate transactions for potential tax violations. The walls were closing in from every direction. But perhaps more damaging than any investigation was what happened in her district. Community organizations that had once championed her began publicly withdrawing their support. The Queen's Democratic Party issued a statement expressing disappointment and calling for new leadership. Primary challengers announced their candidacies, all running on the theme of actual constituent service over national celebrity. And the constituents themselves, the working families who had believed in her promise of authentic representation, felt the deepest betrayal. Town halls organized by community groups without her drew hundreds of people sharing stories of unanswered letters, ignored pleas for help, and growing disillusionment. The testimonials Kennedy had shown were just the beginning. There were thousands more stories of neglect, of a congresswoman too busy being famous to do her job. In Washington, Democratic leadership maintained a careful distance. They released tepid statements about waiting for investigations to conclude while privately expressing relief that one of their most unpredictable members had been neutralized. Republicans, meanwhile, used the hearing as a teaching moment, a perfect illustration of the gap between progressive rhetoric and reality. On a quiet Thursday evening, Senator Kennedy sat on his porch in Madisonville, watching the sun set over the Tchefuncte River. His phone had finally stopped ringing constantly, though interview requests still poured in. His wife Becky brought him sweet tea and settled into the rocking chair beside him. "You've been quiet," she observed. "Been thinking about that young woman," Kennedy admitted, "wondering if I was too hard on her." "John Kennedy," Becky said firmly, "she came after you. She thought you'd be an easy target. She learned otherwise." "She did," Kennedy agreed, "but she's young enough to be my granddaughter. Maybe with a lighter touch, she could have learned the same lessons without having her career destroyed." "Could she?" Becky challenged gently. "Some people only learn through consequences. You gave her consequences. What she does with them is her choice." Kennedy's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then sat up straighter. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear enough. "Senator Kennedy, this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I know you have no reason to read this or respond. I want you to know I've spent the last 3 weeks truly reflecting on what happened. You were right about everything. I got lost in the fame, the attention, the performance. I forgot why I ran for office in the first place. I've enrolled in graduate courses in economics and policy at NYU. I'm holding town halls in my district, actually listening for the first time. I'm helping constituents with no cameras, no social media posts. I'm trying to earn back their trust. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I should even try to run for re-election. But I wanted you to know that your rebuke, as devastating as it was also necessary. Thank you for caring enough about good governance to expose bad faith. I'm trying to do better. I hope someday to deserve the opportunity to serve people again." Kennedy read the message twice, then showed it to Becky. "Well," she said after a moment, "maybe something good can come from all this after all." "Maybe," Kennedy agreed. He typed a brief response. "Congresswoman, grace isn't earned through performance. It's found through genuine service. Your constituents need help, not a celebrity. Be present for them. Learn policy. Pass legislation that actually helps people. That's the work. If you do it without cameras, without seeking credit, you might find the fulfillment you were always chasing in the wrong places. Good luck." He sent the message and set his phone aside. The sun had fully set now, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening Louisiana sky. "Do you think she'll actually change?" Becky asked. Kennedy rocked slowly in his chair, considering. "People can surprise you. I've seen folks hit rock bottom and come back stronger. I've also seen them dig deeper. The choice is hers now. All I can do is hope she makes the right one." His phone buzzed again. This time it was his grandson. "Grandpa, my teacher showed us the hearing in class today. She said you were mean but right. I don't understand how you can be both." Kennedy smiled and typed his response. "Son, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell someone a hard truth they need to hear. Being kind isn't the same as being nice. Sometimes you have to hurt someone's feelings to help them become who they're meant to be. I wasn't trying to be mean. I was trying to teach. Whether the lesson sticks is up to the student." As the night deepened over Louisiana, Senator Kennedy reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him to this moment. A routine hearing transformed into a political earthquake. A young congresswoman's career potentially ended or potentially saved, depending on what she did next. A reminder that in politics, as in life, authenticity eventually matters more than performance. Inside, the evening news played on low volume. Analysts were still dissecting every moment of the hearing, debating its implications, wondering whether it represented a broader reckoning for performative politics. Kennedy had declined to participate in that conversation. He had said what needed saying. The rest was commentary. "You know what your daddy would say right now?" Becky asked. Kennedy chuckled. He'd say, "Johnny, you can shear a sheep many times, but you can only skin it once. You skinned that girl. Question is whether she'll grow new wool. And what do you think, will she?" Kennedy was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars multiply across the vast Louisiana sky. "I think she's got a choice. She can blame everyone else and double down on performance, or she can actually learn and become the leader she always could have been. I hope she chooses growth, but hope isn't the same as expectation." The night air carried the sound of cicadas and distant frogs, the soundtrack of the South that had been the background music to Kennedy's entire life. He had grown up here, learned his values here, built his career from this foundation of community and service. The idea that public office was about serving others, not elevating yourself, wasn't just political philosophy for him. It was lived experience. That's why AOC's betrayal of her constituents had cut so deep. That's why he had been so thorough in exposing her hypocrisy. Not because he enjoyed destruction, but because he genuinely believed that public service meant something sacred, and watching someone treat it as a path to celebrity offended his fundamental sense of right and wrong. "You did the right thing," Becky said quietly, reading his thoughts the way only a spouse of 50 years could. Someone needed to say it. Someone needed to show that consequences still exist. "I know," Kennedy agreed, "but that doesn't mean it feels good." They sat in comfortable silence as the Louisiana night embraced them. Tomorrow there would be more calls, more requests, more people wanting to discuss the hearing. But tonight there was just the peace of home, the comfort of conscience, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for one day at least, truth had mattered more than performance. Inside, Kennedy's phone continued to buzz with messages, but he ignored them all. The work was done. The lesson was taught. Whatever came next was beyond his control. As he prepared to head inside for the evening, Kennedy paused and looked back at the river one last time. In the darkness, he could just make out the gentle movement of water, constant and unchanging, flowing as it had for millions of years before politicians existed, and as it would long after they were all forgotten. That perspective, more than anything, reminded him why he had spent 4 decades in public service. Not for legacy or fame, but because for a brief moment in the vast sweep of history, he had the opportunity to make things slightly better for people who needed help. That was the job. That was always the job. Everything else, including viral hearings and destroyed reputations, was just noise. He went inside, turned off his phone, and went to bed, secure in the knowledge that he had done his duty as he understood it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve. But tonight he could rest. The hearing was over. The reckoning was complete. And in the end, the lesson was simple. Authenticity matters, service matters, truth matters. Performance and celebrity might win the day, but they don't sustain a career built on deception. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had learned that lesson the hard way, exposed before the entire nation as a fraud who had betrayed the very people she claimed to represent. Whether she would take that lesson to heart and rebuild herself into something genuine, or whether she would retreat into victimhood and blame, remained to be seen. But Senator John Kennedy had done all he could do. He had held up the mirror and forced her to see the truth. What she did with that reflection was entirely up to her. And as the Louisiana night settled over his home, bringing with it the peace of conscience and the comfort of duty fulfilled, Kennedy slept the sleep of someone who had spoken truth to power, even when power wore the face of a young, progressive icon. The revolution had been televised. And in the end, it wasn't the revolution anyone expected. It was the revolution of accountability, of consequences, of the simple truth that you cannot build a career on lies and hypocrisy forever. Eventually, someone will call you on it. And when they do, all the Instagram followers and Twitter engagement in the world won't save you from the reckoning you've earned. That was the real lesson of the hearing. Not that AOC was uniquely corrupt, but that performance politics, untethered from genuine service and accountability, eventually collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. And when it does, the fall is spectacular, complete, and entirely self-inflicted. The cameras always stop rolling eventually, and when they do, all that remains is the truth of who you really are and what you've actually done. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that truth had proven devastating. Whether it would prove transformative remained to be seen. But for Senator John Kennedy, the truth had always been simple. Serve people, know your subject, live your values, and never forget that public office is a privilege, not a platform for self-promotion. Those principles had guided his entire career. They had sustained him through this difficult day, and they would continue to guide him through whatever came next. In the end, that was all any public servant could do: show up, do the work, tell the truth, and let the chips fall where they may. The hearing heard round the world was over. The lesson had been taught. The rest, as they say, was up to the students. And in the darkness of a Louisiana night, Senator John Kennedy slept peacefully, his conscience clear, his duty done, his values intact. It was enough. The political landscape had fundamentally shifted. The age of the untouchable career politician, insulated by power and party, was over. A new, more fragile but more honest equilibrium had been established. The swamp had not been drained entirely. It never could be. But a powerful new filtration system had been put in place, and it had all started with 5 black binders and a prosecutor who refused to be intimidated. In the end, the legacy of that day was not one of destruction, but of renewal. It was a brutal, painful, but necessary reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires vigilance. It demands participation. It entrusts its citizens with the power to hold their leaders accountable, a power that lies dormant until someone has the courage to use it. The story of AOC is a testament to what happens when that power is forgotten. The story of Senator Kennedy is a testament to what happens when it is remembered. The choice of which story our future will tell is not up to the politicians in Washington. It is up to us. If you believe that accountability matters, that truth has no party, and that the powerful must answer to the people they serve, then make your voice heard. Smash that like button, subscribe to this channel for more stories that matter, and share this video with anyone who still believes in the promise of a government of by and for the people. The accountability era has begun. Be a part of it.